So welcome everybody to the Psychology Platforms event. Today we're going to be focusing on assistant psychologist interviews, and I'm Matashi. I'm one of the co-founders of the Psychology Platform and also known as Review and Mind.
And I'm Sharon, one of the other co-founders, and I'm also known as Sharon the Psych. So just to go over what this workshop will include today. So we're going to be speaking about how you can prepare for your assistant psychologist interview, when you should stop preparing, what if you don't get the role, our top tips, and we'll also be given an example of how we would answer a question and also some models to support that answer. But to note that we won't be sharing specific AP interview questions that we've been asked in our own personal interviews. We've taken them from a list off of the ClinSci forum, which we'll link later on in the workshop.
So just to begin, actually, I think particularly when you've handed in your assistant psychologist application, and we would have covered loads of those things in our previous event workshop video, but it's really then to think about how you're going to prepare for your interview. And I guess there's one of two ways that you can start to do that, like when you've actually been shortlisted for an interview, but also if you feel as though you're quite ready and you've submitted a few assistant psychologist applications and now you kind of want to start preparing yourself. I think the main place to really start is to really just go back over your application and see what you wrote, like the role that you applied for, and to think about the service as a whole. I think commonly people kind of forget to go back to the job description, and that'll really kind of tell you the responsibilities and kind of showcase to you what the role of an assistant psychologist will look like in that service. And I think for me, particularly when my experience has been a lot of neuropsychological work, it was really helpful for me to go and read that and think about what type of neuropsychological work might I be doing and the clients that I might be working with. That can then sort of inform when you're sort of preparing to think about the questions that you might be asked and to just note them down about what's sort of coming up in the job description and what they may ask for. I think whilst you're doing that and you're thinking about the job description and the role that you're applying for, hold in mind your own previous experiences and why that makes you a really good candidate. Not everyone who gets the role is going to have previous assistant psychologist experience. And whilst that's sometimes sort of written as an essential or desirable criteria, it doesn't always mean that that's the only way to get an assistant psychologist post. And other experiences are really valuable, whether that's sort of a personal or lived experience, experience in sort of support work or as a HCA, even as a researcher. You can really kind of hone in on your skills and remember them as to what and why they're important for this assistant psychologist role that you've applied to. I guess one of the difficulties that comes when you are preparing is to think about the role of an assistant psychologist, and it's probably less clear than a clinical psychologist. But one of the things that I did when I was preparing is to see what the competencies were for a clinical psychologist and those themes. So whether that was kind of research, the clinical work, people's experience, dilemmas and supervision, and to really think about how they apply to the role of assistant psychologist. Again, going back to that jobs and responsibilities in the job description, and to think about what I might be asked. I think those give you really good clues as to what the interview process might be like and to help you prepare. So you can think about how you're going to utilise your own information, where you might need to go and grab a bit more, and to think about what you may be asked and somehow what your answers might be. And I think just when you're thinking about preparing for any role, really take that time to personalise it. Don't forget to think about why you want that particular role. I think really commonly, and I did this at the beginning as well, just to think, I just want to be an AP, that's all I want. And my answers at that point probably weren't specific, and I probably couldn't tell you why I wanted this specific role in a specific service. So think about what your reason is to be an assistant psychologist, why this particular service, and have a proper answer, because that is, I guess, something that you need to know, as well as what the interviewers will be wanting to know as well.
So I guess one of the big things when you are preparing is to know when to stop, because one thing that I know pretty for certain that they don't like is when we come in overly rehearsed, especially when we come in maybe memorizing some of the answers to some questions that we found or created. So normally you have about a week's notice, sometimes a bit more for these interviews. And I would say just sometime each day, maybe a bit in the morning, sometime in the afternoon, but definitely don't overdo it. I think for the interviews where I learn answers and I spent a lot of time preparing and researching, those were actually the interviews that I didn't get. But the interview where I kind of let go a little bit and spent some more time reflecting, and more thinking about how I can manage my nerves on the day, that's when I was more successful in getting the interview. So just to be aware of that.
So I think, I guess to kind of help when people do get an interview, we wanted to sort of show you what it is like to answer a question. And one of the things that a lot of people asked is also how to do that reflectively. So Sharon is going to be demonstrating this. So Sharon, like, I guess to reiterate to everyone who's also going to be watching, we got this question, as we mentioned earlier, from the Kunsai forum, and there is a huge, gigantic list of interview questions that are relative to all stages of psychology, I think also research as well as clinical psychology. And I guess just being really important that these are probably a little bit old, and they're not questions that we specifically have had and want to just give you the answer to. These are just sort of ones that we've completely freestyled. But just kind of have that caution of like these can help you prepare, but like don't over prepare, and just also thinking about the way in which you use it. This isn't just to help you get the role, it's to think about how you're going to prepare. But these aren't like specific questions, they won't get you the role, they're just here to help. Are you ready, Sharon?
Yes, I am.
So, why would you want to work for our inpatient service?
So, from working as an AP in a community team, I saw how much the systems around the client can impact their mental health. So, for example, I was working with an individual who was dealing with a lot of financial difficulties at the time and found themselves in temporary accommodation where it was very unstable and they didn't know when they would be moved around. So, just thinking about how that actually impacted their mental health, and just that lack of security, really. And so, I think I'm really interested and quite passionate about working within an inpatient service, because I think this gives us a really great opportunity to exert some control over these extraneous variables that can impact someone's mental health. And I think that's such a unique opportunity. I also think that I'm really well equipped to work in an inpatient service from my experience of working as an ABA tutor. So at first, in my role as an ABA tutor, I felt very overwhelmed and quite intimidated by the fast-paced environment that I was working in. And I actually found that I was burning out really quickly, which was then impacting on the way in which I was supporting the client. And I found that as I became more burnt out, I wasn't as maybe as patient as I should be. I wasn't as detailed in the approach that I took. And so you could really see a clear kind of correlation between burnout and the way in which I was supporting the individual. But what I learned from that experience was how important self-care is for us as someone supporting another person, because within that aspect of self-care, we're better able to manage burnout, which then actually made me feel more competent in managing a fast-paced environment. And I get the sense that your service as an inpatient service is quite fast-paced. And so I think that because I've now learned how to work well in that environment, I would do really well in your service.
Thank you.
So I guess that is something that I've obviously prepared. I didn't just reel that off now. But what we would use in preparing our answers are either the STAR method or Rolf's what, so what, now what model. So Hitashi, do you want to explain a bit about the STAR method?
And I mean, I guess it's really important to highlight actually that both Sharon and I have different ways to structure our answers, and there really isn't a right way to do it and add the reflections. And I guess so when Sharon was talking, like I was in my head sort of thinking about the STAR method, and you could kind of see for the beginning of like the situation and the task that was kept really brief by Sharon, so really thinking about briefly introducing herself to that question. And at that point, for the situation, whatever the question, you kind of just want to be sharing like the what, the when, the where, like setting that background, but really concisely. And you can also just link that in with the aim. So whether they're asking you a question about a particular experience you've had, why you want the role, you just kind of bring it back to the question and let them know that you're structuring yourself, but giving yourself that time to actually answer the question. You then saw sort of Sharon thinking about her own experiences. So that's kind of like action of what she did. So she spoke about the ABA tutoring and what that's been like. So again, like really brief, but the result, which is kind of like the outcomes, when Sharon was explaining sort of feeling like that burnout and how that impact was on her, and the reflection about how she was then going to implement that into an inpatient unit was really important because you could see exactly what the result was. It wasn't her, it can be a positive answer, but it wasn't you sort of saying like, I've done all these amazing things, I'm going to be brilliant at this role. You kind of need to add that with an air of reflection, so thinking about what was it that happened, what was it that you learned, and you at that time may not have actually learned anything or taken away in that specific time point. But you can kind of caveat that as like what you know now about something you did previously and really hold in that. And if you can't think about reflection in that moment, sort of maybe add into the role and think about what is it that I want to gain from this role, because that's also a reflection. But for me, that's kind of how I approach to like sort of any assistant psychologist like questions I was asked. I would really just take a moment, structure like kind of what have they said to me and like what am I going to say, and use that sort of start method. But I'd be interested to see how you do yours with the Ralph model.
Yeah. So I think it's also really important to know what Hitachi said about not just saying what you're really good at. I actually think it's easier in interviews to speak about your weaknesses in that way, and to reflect on maybe the gaps in your learning and what this prospective role might provide you with, or what you've learned and how you'll bring that to the new role. But I think it is maybe a bit easier to use situations where things haven't gone perfectly, because then it will allow you some space to reflect. Um, but with Rolf's model, it's what, so what, now what. So the what is what happened. So where were you? Who was there? Just a short description as well. This should be probably the smallest part of your answer, just to provide some background history, maybe what role you're in and your responsibilities. Very minimal though, and about that situation. So what is about, so what makes this situation relevant to the question that you're answering, or why was it a significant situation for you in your learning and development? And so I guess just linking it back to the answer that I spoke about. So I spoke about a fast-paced environment, and so the link between burnout. So that is kind of, so what about that role as an ABA tutor was important? It was the fact that it made me feel burnt out, and then I learned how to really utilize self-care. And now what are you going to do in the future? Links to now what. And so that's thinking about how you're going to use your previous experiences for any future ones. So whether you're going to do things the same because it went well, whether you're going to do something differently because it didn't go so well, or whether you hope to learn a new skill in the future role that you're applying to. And so thinking about how your past experiences can support you with that. And I guess for the question that I answered, it was that bottom section about how now using self-care, I guess intentionally, will benefit their service working in an inpatient unit where it is quite fast-paced. Yeah, so I guess both models are fairly similar. But what I really like about the STAR method, actually, I didn't use the STAR method that much, but I really like the task and the aim. So really remembering what the aim of the question is that you're having to answer, I think is really important, because it's so easy to kind of go off on a tangent. But yeah, and also these models work for different situations, as you'll probably see when you're doing your interview prep, for sure. Right. So after the interview, what I would suggest is taking a break before doing anything. So I like to rest, then assess. Because you're feeling very overwhelmed. You've done so well to get to the point of the interview. You deserve a break. And I know it's very easy to go back home and start rehearsing or replaying, everything that went on in that room. But it's not that helpful. It's just going to make you feel stressed out, and just overly anxious. So I would suggest just resting. Take a day, take an afternoon, just something. Provide a buffer before you assess how you performed. But what I normally do is write down, as soon as I get out of the room, because my memory is awful, is just write down all of the questions and your answers. I wasn't so good at writing down my answers, but definitely the questions if you can. This will just help with your future interviews, especially if you remember to write down your answers or just a few points, because then you can see where you went well, where things went well, and where things went wrong. And when you do get your feedback, it will allow you to have some context around that feedback, so you can link it more specifically. And then it can also help you with setting some goals for when you do start the role if you are successful. But I think the main takeaway message is for after the interview is to rest and to give yourself a pat on the back for getting through it and celebrating a little bit, because it is an amazing accomplishment to get that far. But I guess there's also the outcome that you won't get the role, and there probably will be at least one interview where you don't get the role. It's very normal. No one really comes out of their first assistant psychologist interview getting the job. That is just the way it is at the moment. It's very competitive, but that doesn't mean it should stop you, because you'll be able to do it. But if you don't get the role, it's fine. It's a really difficult situation. And it's so normal to be really upset, to cry. I mean, I've cried over so many assistant psychologist interviews, and it's normal. Yes, it's only a job, but it's also quite it's really difficult when you get rejected and rejected and rejected over and over again, especially after you've finished your undergraduate degree and you've got X amount of volunteer experience and you still get rejected. It is tough. So allow yourself the space to sit with that, to accept it, and just get it all out. When they do call, because they typically call with the results, ask for your feedback. They normally offer that to you anyway. And even if you're apprehensive because you don't want to hear about all of the things you did wrong, just do it, because it will help you in the long run. And it is just beneficial for your own growth. So don't shy away from that. And if they don't give you a call with the outcome and they just send you an email, you can email them and request feedback, and just keep asking them, because you deserve at least that, especially if you've got to the interview phase. And then also spend some time reflecting on the questions that you were asked and the answers that you might give them in future interviews. So what did you like about your previous answers and what didn't you like? And thinking about how you can change this in your future interviews. So really, it's a lot about trial and error for these interviews, just to see what works well for you in that environment as well. So it does take some practice, but you will get there. But just allow yourself to feel all of the emotions after the interview. So now I've got some top tips. Tashi, do you want to start off?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think really kind of the main thing that I wish I knew when I was like really starting out for the assistant psychologist interviews is to kind of be yourself. I think for the first few that I was rejected for, I was kind of going in as this like psychology professional or someone who like just had to have it all together and like had all of the essential desirable criteria, like wasn't reflecting at all. And I think certainly so I guess I'm happy to share that I had two which were unsuccessful, and one of them had really useful feedback, and it was just about to bring myself out, which I have actually done in my application form, but not done in person, and to really think about how you sell yourself to someone. I think as much as you may meet the criteria, what's really important is they're actually looking for a nice person who can fit into the team, who can do the job, and like kind of like genuinely is someone who's going to be a nice fit for the service. And I think really thinking about how you're going to convey yourself and the ways in which you do that. And again, I said this earlier, but really thinking about why you want this role and how you're going to tell them. I think a nice way to really think about that is if you can tell someone in a non-psychology world, that's a really nice way of why you're doing the role. You may actually have a service user in your panel who will ask you this, and I think as much as you really want to be an assistant psychologist, you really have to be committed to the service. And I think there is that distinction between applying to lots of roles and getting shortlisted for lots of AP roles, but not actually making it into kind of securing the role because you're not as passionate. And that's really important to be able to deliver and share. They don't want, again, just someone who's got these stock answers. They really want a person. And also hold in mind kind of what questions you want to ask. I think we briefly discussed this in the application event, but one of the things that I used to do prior to sort of like, I'd submit my application and then try and like have a conversation with the service. And I think that really helped me think about the service as a whole, how it would be like to work there. And don't sort of like end your interview and like run out the door. If you have any burning questions, ask them. They may not have considered something that you already know about. And just to think about, you know, even small things about your own development, how are they going to support you? As much as you're going for an assistant psychologist role, you are also trying to learn and get, I assume, sort of in a clinical psychologist position, and you want to know kind of that they're going to be there for you as much as you're going to be in this role. And it's a paid role, so you're equally allowed lots of the same things that other qualified members of staff are allowed in the NHS. So really thinking about asking about that, and if they don't know, they'll get back to you. It's not a bad thing, but really think about those questions that you want to ask. I think particularly if, you know, we're in the pandemic at the moment and lots of interviews are online, and I kind of wonder about if that will stay, mainly because I think people can get a lot more done online and see many more candidates. But I would say really resist any temptation to cheat. There, you know, particularly when I was in one of my previous roles and they were recruiting for my assistant psychologist post, there are often multiple members on the interview panel. One of them will probably be watching where you're looking whilst the other one's marking. So don't have things around you and make it obvious, because when you're reading off something, you sort of turn a bit robotic. You don't have that natural flair, and it's really obvious when you're talking that way and when you're not looking at the camera. But also it's just super distracting. You kind of really want a nice clean setup, whether you kind of have things around you that can help with it, so a plain sheet of paper and a pen. Really don't put things around you that are just going to clutter your thoughts and not help you think straight. And think about what you might need if you are preparing for an interview, either face-to-face or in person, and whether you can ask for some adjustments like pen and paper, and if that is okay. Try to ask those things, even though if it feels, you know, as a reasonable adjustment. They often do these things for you, but it's always nice to ask and not have, like, especially if I was someone who was on an interview panel, I'd want to know what you're doing when you're looking down and not just assuming that you can do these things. And I think finally, you know, I've had some pretty tricky questions as in an AP interview, and I probably have, so I don't know, a lot more. Some more than others, where I've really kind of just had to ask to wait a few minutes to really think. And I think like you just really shouldn't be afraid to do that, because you're not going into a role where you're expected to know everything. And I think, hopefully I'm correct in this, but I'm pretty sure even when you go for a clinical psychologist interview down the future, you're also not expected to know everything. Like, it's not about being perfect. So you can say you don't know, but I think it's the way in which you do so. Thinking about, can you take a break and just having a moment to collect my thoughts, or I'm not really sure, but I've had this experience, can I tell you this? Like just really thinking about a most polite way of saying, I haven't got that answer, but I have got this, or I don't know at the moment, but I'm really thinking about this in this role. And that will really help you and take you probably to giving your personable skills rather than being, I guess, giving a stock answer to a question that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think those are all really good tips, Hitachi. And also for that last one, you can even say what you kind of think you would do in that situation, and how maybe you would approach a situation if you were in the role, and really thinking about the role of your supervisor in situations where you don't know. So yeah, I think it's much better to say that you don't know than to make something up that is completely wrong, or try and fit another answer to a question. Um, yeah, so some of my tips would be to pause after every question and allow yourself some space to breathe. This is kind of a rule that I made up after my second interview, where I realized it was my nerves that were really getting in the way of me just doing well in an interview. So I set myself a rule of pausing after every question, and making sure that I felt present in the room, rather than just speaking straight away, because it gives you some time to think. I also found that pretending I was going into a meeting with some colleagues rather than an interview panel really helped in just letting my personality come through. And it also reminded me that I will be working with these people in the future. And so it is nice to feel as though I can just have a normal conversation with them. And I think having a conversation is a lot easier than it being a question and answer, which I know an interview can feel like at times, because it is formatted in that way. But what you find is that you can have a narrative within your interview, and kind of maybe refer back to previous answers that you said, or um, go in with a more conversational tone rather than feeling like you're in an interrogation room. So I think just reframing kind of who you're talking with helps a lot. But to also be very mindful of the language that you use about service users or clients in interviews. Maybe pick up on what the panel are using and what language they're using. So whether they might be using patient, client, service user, whichever, because they usually include a service user on the panel. And to make sure that you are just being quite compassionate about the language that you're using, and just to be careful with that, because there are certain words and certain topics which should be approached quite sensitively, especially with a service user on the panel. And it will also give them a good sense of how you will speak to service users when you are in that actual role. So I know we've mentioned this before, but don't memorize any answers. I really don't think it's helpful at all. I think it's more helpful to practice being reflective, so using either the STAR method or Rolf's model, because it comes across very robotic. And I actually think that when you're being interviewed for an AP post, they're looking for your ability to learn and to grow, because in AP positions you are learning constantly. You never really know what's going on. You're always learning new things. I think that's the skill that they want the most, and that comes from being reflective rather than your ability to memorize loads of answers. So yeah, I think that is one to definitely kind of focus in on, is don't memorize any answers. But now we've got some of the questions that you will send in via Instagram. So if you haven't already, then please give us a follow on the Psychology platform Instagram, because that's where we hold all of the kind of stories for the events, and also where you can submit your questions. So should we just go from left to right, Ashley? I feel like that's the way.
Definitely. I
So,
mean, gosh, the first one, sorry. I don't think I got stumped by it. I might let you go first. So, how would you bring psychological theory into your answers?
in an AP interview, honestly, I didn't, and I don't think I would. I don't know if you did. I really didn't at all in any of them. I really focused in on my personal experiences and how they make me a good candidate for the role that I'm applying to. And I don't think there's a need, but I think because in some of the person specifications, I think some of them do say like knowledge of psychological theories, doesn't it, or mental health difficulties. But I don't think they are looking for you to outline a whole theory, but rather just maybe an awareness, or even more so an awareness of a certain service group or population. So, for example, knowledge of what challenges there might be for working with people who are living with dementia, maybe. But I've never brought in actual psychological theory into any of my answers. Don't know about you.
I mean, I'm probably very similar. I think it's really interesting that they kind of write that on the job description. I think it's mainly like their essential and desirable criteria, which you end up writing a little sentence of course. So you've done your degree, like you will know some theories. Like you have just like never prepared for any, like it's never been kind of the top of my sort of thing that I need to learn. And I think even off the top of my head now, you can kind of pull some out your head in terms of like what you did at undergrad, like really, really basic ones. I will not be expecting you to have like a really in-depth one for your service.
Mm,
But I wonder when people in their job description, I think in hindsight now, I kind of wonder if they're sort of asking about almost a theory that their service and like kind of the structure and model that they're using.
yeah.
Um, so I know like lots of things now are kind of in a trauma informed care sort of like model, and I think that would be more valuable to think about because that is about a service structure and how they deliver their care, what that means, as opposed to psychological theory, because that probably just isn't always going to be applicable to lots of different clinical populations. And I wonder if it is also just about rather than the specific theory that is underpinning a sort of mental health condition or symptom, really actually knowing your own psychological knowledge of that condition rather than the theory. You wouldn't sort of go in and if you're working in a GP, you wouldn't sort of be like, oh, I don't know what the common cold is. That you kind of want to know like what depression is, but you don't need to know the theory that's underpinning that. You just kind of need to know the real basics. And I wonder if that's actually, something that they're really trying to get at from the job description, but they've just not done that very well.
Yeah, I agree. Um, so the next one is what to wear and what sort of questions are asked. Um, So there's no silly questions at all because I know I was kind of fretting over what to wear for every single interview ever. I've actually just got one interview outfit that I wear for every single interview. I wore it to my undergrad placement interview. I've worn it for all of my assistant interviews, and I also wore it for my deep inside interview just because it keeps it easy. But I like to wear something. I wear a dress, but quite minimal. It's not casual, but it's not overly smart. It's just something I would wear to work. So I'd say it's more kind of smart casual, maybe just office wear. There's something that you're comfortable in, something that's obviously not too revealing. But I don't think there's like a right or wrong. Just look presentable and feel comfortable, I think, are the main things.
I'd probably match the same. I mean, I don't have one outfit, but I think very much in terms of like smart casual. I'm probably more on the casual end. To be fair, I'm more on the casual when I start the job. But I would say that when it comes to sort of interviews, yeah, just that smart casual vibe, whether that is, I mean, I guess both Sharon and I can only really speak from a female perspective, but very much kind of a dress, skirt and top, like trousers sort of thing. I'm pretty sure I probably have. I think for one of my honorary roles, I did wear like kind of a black jeans and a nice shirt. You can kind of like do that just kind of with like smart shoes. Again, like I think it's kind of psychologists are people that work in like big ivory towers and you don't sit on a computer all day. Like, you don't need to be in a suit and shirt and like that's just not really what you need to wear. If that's kind of your everyday wear, like you obviously can, but you don't have to turn up with this kind of look of what is a psychologist. And I guess to just sort of answer the latter part, I mean, so in this like, workshop, we haven't really shared any specific questions in the roles that we've done. But obviously, we did link the clinical psychology link for the gigantic list of questions. And I think just both from a fairness perspective, we really want everyone to be on a level playing ground. But also, it's just not helpful to know the questions and then go into an interview. But in the themes, really go back and think about what it is that we've spoken about, break down your role into themes, and you'll kind of be able to pick up questions for yourself and ask someone who's actually not familiar to the role if they can think of any questions they'd like to ask you, knowing what they've read.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of the questions will be about your experiences. So definitely the more reflective questions rather than the kind of knowledge-based ones. You will never get asked a question, I don't think, anyway, about kind of like what is depression or like what is anxiety. None of those questions will ever really come up. So it's definitely more about your own experiences. And even if we were to tell you the questions that we got given in our interviews, the questions are likely to be quite different. And also, it's not helpful memorizing the answers. So even if you do happen to stumble across the questions for your specific interview, don't memorize your answers, because it just comes across very robotic and it doesn't show your full capabilities.
I think
So
also, sorry, you go.
there you go.
No, I was just going to say also to think about what happens if you do know the questions. If you get the role, you may be questioned about how you sort of, like, I guess if it's very obvious that you knew the questions, you could be pulled up on that before they've made a decision. And if you haven't, kind of what lasting impact that kind of leaves. Lots of assistant psychologist roles are fixed term, and some of them are pretty short when you're thinking about the doctorate season and people handing in their notice. If you kind of go for a job twice and you've been a bit questionable with sort of like knowing the questions and answers, that could have an impact on the choice that people make. And I think it goes back to what we discussed in a previous workshop as well about being honest. Don't sort of exaggerate anything that you have, and don't sort of abuse the knowledge that you've been given or that you've been shared, because it will come back in your detriment, and that's not really that's not helpful in getting you an AP role.
No, definitely not. And also, just another thing, that the list is very long, and so I don't want people to look at the list and feel like they need to go through every question, because it really is. I think they've just got people to submit questions that they may have heard before. It's really, really long, so don't feel like you have to go through all of the questions, and don't feel overwhelmed by it in that way. So the next question is, how long should answers be?
How long is a piece of string? I mean, it really depends on the question, and I would just say listen to the question. Like Sharon said, take a pause, really think about what it is. Like, you don't want to be sat there for 5 minutes and given an answer when all they've asked you is like, are you able to commute for this role? Like, that's like, honestly, it's a yes or no question. And you'll be kidding. Like, I'm not kidding when I say that people do that. And when you're nervous, you will, but really think about like what it is they've asked. Give yourself more time to structure yourself and take a deep breath as opposed to the answer. And to also just like read the room, whether you're in like person or online. I've definitely seen interviews sort of like get bored or heard those kind of horror stories. So when you're talking, like, try to be engaging, but if you notice someone not at all interested in anything you're saying, wrap it up and even apologise and just say, I've actually noticed I've gone on a bit of a tangent, I'm really sorry, and kind of compose yourself for the next question, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I don't think we can say how long an answer should be. I just think you should cover, if you can be reflective in the question, and I think for most interview questions you can be, as long as you're hitting those points of whichever model you're using. So if you're using Rolf's model, if you're hitting the what, so what, now what, then that's how long your answer should be. And just make sure you're answering the question. So that's why it's really important that you go in composed, and that if you feel like you are going on, just stop and ask them to repeat the question. That's okay, just stay on track. So I think it's quite hard to say how long, but then also I know for some interviews they do tell you how long the interview is going to be and how many questions you're going to get. So if in that moment you can do a bit of quick maths and figure out how much time you maybe should be spending on each question, then that might be a good idea to give you a rule of thumb. But you also don't want to have that going on in the back of your mind of like, oh, I'm running out of time. So I think more focus in on whether you're answering the question and whether you're hitting the points of the reflective model that you're using.
So our next one is, when you say use reflection in your answers, does it have to be for every single question?
Um, I It's a difficult one, because I think for most of the questions that they ask you, they are looking for you to be reflective. And I'm only speaking from my own personal experience now. But in the interview where I made sure and I forced myself to be reflective in every single question, that is the one where I did get the job. So part of me wants to say, try to, if you can. But if it's about how long is it going to take you to commute, then obviously not. If the question is clearly not one to reflect on, then don't use it. But as much as you can, try to, um, because there are some questions that aren't outrightly a reflective question, but you can use it in a reflective way. Um, yeah, I don't know if that's kind of the same kind of thoughts that you have, Hitashi.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of very similar to the last one, isn't it? Of like, I'm probably similar to you actually. I think I've always done well when I have shared a reflection, and yeah, I'm hesitant to say you need to do reflection in every single answer, but listen to the question. I would also like caveat that with I am a probably more reflective person, just kind of naturally, but psychologically or not, I think I kind of have that to my personality probably a lot easier than other people. And I think that probably works in my advantage where I can add in that added reflection, maybe just a little bit more subtly. That's just kind of how I am. So really hold that in mind. But I'd say just kind of listen to the question. And again, if you're not sure, you could be like, I do have a reflection on this. Would you like me to share that? If you're kind of noticing that they're on a tight schedule, all of these things happen. And I think sometimes they might say no, but they will register that of like you've actually asked them. You probably did have a reflection, but because of time. So kind of think about how you're presenting yourself and like how you can share your reflections. And reflections don't typically have to be that long. It could just be something really just so mundane and like a little like finishing, like ending to your sentence. So yeah, I think that's just kind of important to hold in mind, but do it in your own style. Don't do it because we've been successful in reflective questions. I think back to your role. If that service is particularly reflective and in their job description they engage in things like reflective practice or that's the models that they're using with their service users, use that to your advantage. If not, maybe say that's something you're inquisitive about and that's really something you want to engage in.
Yeah, great. How can we be unique?
It probably goes back to what we said at the beginning, but like really being yourself. Um, like I don't think that I think sort of coming into an AP interview as anybody else but yourself is probably going to shoot you in the foot a little bit. To really think about kind of what it is that you want to be doing. If you're not passionate about this role, they're going to be able to tell because not only is an assistant psychologist role really popular, but people will really, really want the role. Um, and you can bring yourself like in certain questions or just in the way that you conduct yourself. I think it's kind of a link to kind of having that composure, listen to the question, what is not oversharing, and kind of what are you prepared to give away in your answers? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to being yourself in the interviews, which I think also links in with going in and pretending that they're your colleagues.
Mm,
Because I think as soon as I did that, I allowed myself to speak like a normal person. Um, Normal person, as in casually. You don't have to use big fancy words in your interviews. Just be yourself, genuinely how you are on a day-to-day basis, because that's what you're going to turn up as on your first day at work if you get the role. So I think the best way to be unique is being yourself because there's not going to be. I know some people say, "Oh yeah, wear a bright top so that you stand out and they remember you," or say something about something that's quite, a hot topic, but really if you're just doing something to do something, like it's not going to come across that well. And I think your passion is going to be the thing that will make you stand out the most because that they can really pick out from a group of people. And to be memorable is to be someone who's really going to maybe make a difference in their service and someone who they feel like they can work with. So it is all about being yourself. And also managing your nerves because I think nerves are one of the biggest things that can like get in the way of you showing up as yourself in any space. But I think we've got a question on that in a bit, so I'm not gonna dive into that.
so did you do a role play in any of your AP roles or interviews rather?
I did do one. Um, um, what can I say about that role play? It was, I think, with the role plays, from the feedback that I got, what they're really looking for is how you can relate to a client. So mine was a phone conversation, can't recall what it was about entirely, but I remember my feedback being that I needed to slow down, because I do have the habit of being very quick in general when speaking, but also when I'm nervous that can go like 10 times the speed. But also picking up on risk, I think, might come up in a role play, so just being aware of those things. But I think if you're going for an assistant psychologist interview, if you've gotten to that point, you will be fine, so long as you're careful about the language you use, you pick up on the risk, and you just come across as a compassionate individual in that role play, I think.
Definitely. I mean, I've actually never had to do a role play in any of my AP roles, so that was a dream. But I'd probably say, actually, whilst I haven't had to do it in an interview, I have done it in the role. So sometimes it can be really nice to think about, because that is just how we learn. And I don't think we had a question on this, but one of the things I have had to do, and I know it is quite common, is having to do a presentation for an AP interview, which I have done. And probably very similarly, like to what Sharon said, like being really mindful of like how you conduct yourself. Um, I think really holding in mind that an assistant psychologist role is a role that you're going to learn from, and your presentation could be on anything. Like it might be research related, it might be related to the post, but I think conducting yourself in, I guess, reflective manner and thinking about sharing how you're curious might really help you in a presentation, because you want to show like what you have achieved. But I think coming across overly confident in that situation may sort of make them think, well, actually, this person has achieved X, Y, and Z. Like, why do they want to be an AP now? Because there will be people who are trying to learn, and you kind of want to correct that balance of, yeah, you really want this role and you're there to learn, but you also have skills. So showcasing that, whether that is in a role play or a presentation.
Definitely. I've never had to do a presentation before, and I'm so happy to never have done that.
It's horrible.
But really good tips from you. Next question is, how do we answer questions about suicide and safeguarding questions?
I think, I mean, in my experience, I feel like I've never outwardly been asked a question about suicidal ideation. I think partly that is because services and psychologists are mindful about that's a trigger warning. This is not just something that, you know, we work in because we're fascinated, but this is people's lives. And I think you never know who's going to be impacted by mental health. I guess already the questions can be quite personal. So for something that can have a lasting impact, that may not be something that they talk about. I also just don't think it's kind of the bread and butter of an assistant psychologist role. It probably hones into risk, what you would do if you felt someone was suicidal in your role, and knowing what to do, how to escalate, which would always be literally the next qualified person or your supervisor, like run to them. You will never have to do all this alone, and I think that's something to really remember. It can feel really scary when you've kind of you've got this title of assistant psychologist and people are coming to you, but you just kind of need to manage that situation there and then, and kind of escalate further as soon as you can ensure safety. But I don't think they would outrightly ask you a question like that. And with safeguarding, I think it's just about knowing the protocol. Again, you're not in a position to be fixing a major safeguarding issue. You just need to know where you're going to escalate, what to do, and it can be really helpful to probably think about the AP role you're applying to, what the safeguarding issues might be in that situation, and just what you might need to do if they say, like, you've been faced with this situation, what are you going to do? But remember your remit. You're not applying to be a clinical psychologist, and that is really good feedback that I received. I went for a role and my answer was really great, but it was probably too high level. I was going to take on too much risk, and that's not the role of an assistant psychologist. I needed to basically say I would manage that situation, and I would then go to my supervisor to get further help for the person. I don't know, what's your experience of that?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been asked a question outrightly about suicide. I think it's it's a very personal topic for a lot of people, and they don't know who they're interviewing. So I think they try to steer clear of that topic. And also for the reasons that Hitachi outlined, we don't have to manage suicide as or suicidal ideation as an assistant. Really, that's definitely not within our remit. Our clinical cases are really held, the responsibility is held by our supervisors. So I think that's also the reason why they don't ask us those questions. But safeguarding questions do come up, and I think mainly you need to be aware of the different kind of safeguarding issues and risks, and how you would follow NHS typical protocol of managing safeguarding. Just being aware that you are going to have to speak with your supervisor or someone who is qualified, and understanding that you don't hold that responsibility. And I think the safeguarding questions come up a lot when they give you if they give you a case study to read, and sometimes they will drip bits of maybe a bit risky information in there, and for you to pick up on that and then mention how you would respond to those risks and about how safeguarding would work in that situation. So I think I would just, in preparation, read up on safeguarding policies so that you're more aware of kind of the different kinds of risk that's out there. So the next question is, how do AP interviews differ from HCA ones, so healthcare assistant ones? So in my healthcare assistant interviews, I think they are looking for less reflective answers. Definitely, they don't want you to reflect, or they're not really looking for that. They're more so looking at whether you are someone who can work with people and provide a good level of care. So I think it is more kind of skills based rather than how AP interviews are led in that way. I think that's probably the main difference. Hitachi, I don't think you've ever had one, or
No, I mean, I've never done a HCA interview, but the only experience I can liken that to is I went for an AP role, which was definitely the role of a HCA and just titled as assistant psychologist. So maybe to be very aware of that. And yeah, obviously in my mindset where I had prepared for an AP role, I just wasn't getting any of the questions. So yeah, I think it is very much kind of knowing those competencies. It's probably less reflective than an AP role. But just being mindful, actually, that's a common experience, unfortunately, that people, particularly when there isn't actually a psychologist in the service, will advocate for an assistant psychologist. And you either may be on one end of the spectrum required to do a lot of clinical work, which you are not kind of at all qualified for, which you kind of need to say no to. Just to remember that we do not have a HCPC qualification that we apply for as an assistant psychologist. You're not qualified to do any of this on your own, or you will kind of have an assistant psychologist title and kind of be working as a HCA or support worker. So really, again, I think whilst I've probably not had that experience, I've just had this experience of turning up for a role which wasn't as described, and I think really kind of check in on what that role is, because you don't really kind of want to be in a situation of getting an AP title and not getting that experience either.
Yeah, definitely. And you see more and more of those crop up. So look out for those. Any roles kind of titled psychology graduate, or just be very wary of those kind of graduate jobs that are listed on Indeed. Some of them are very cleverly worded, and they might not be the job that you are actually looking for.
Definitely. So our next one is tips for calming nerves, especially if you have difficulty articulating when nervous. And I feel like this one just gets me in the feels, because that's me. I am not concise, as people probably realise watching this. And I think that is something you probably have to just, I know we've said this word so many times, you just need to reflect on that. I think if you can recognise that you are not concise, you kind of then need to kind of think about what you need to slow yourself down, answer the question. I can certainly notice that difference between when I didn't get the AP role and when I did, and I think it's just how I calm myself down. And I think for me, it was very much about just taking that deep breath, and what I needed kind of even before, like, so on the day, had this time slot, like I didn't do any prep on the day because that made me feel a lot more contained. For some of them I've turned up and obviously there's lots of people there already. People come early, people are leaving, so you get to see assistant psychologists. I tried to obviously get there early but stay in my car so I didn't have to see or converse with people. I think for me that just felt a lot more containing because I didn't have to worry about, oh, if the person looks so much older, they're obviously going to get the job, or like they look so much more experienced. Your mind plays so many tricks on you, so if you have every opportunity not to let it do that, definitely go for it. And just also like taking water, like that's, your interviewers are also going to have that, and I'm pretty sure your interviewers are going to be really nervous. They are trying to find someone to suit the service and to work with them, particularly as an when they're clinical psychologists. So just remembering that, and I think holding those things in mind, and holding on to actually my own skills helped me reduce my nerves a lot more when I was doing interviews because I'm, in all honesty, there's been like times where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm not even gonna go today because I feel that nervous, and you kind of have to conquer through it. But yeah, that for me worked. Don't know about you.
Yeah, no, I think nerves, just managing those nerves was key for me getting the role. And I think a lot of it is, yeah, to do with preparation and making sure you're not bombarding yourself with information before the day and on the day. I think the morning of your interview is a very important time and should be kept quite yeah, it's you need to keep it really chilled and be kind to yourself in that morning. Treat yourself, do as much preparation the night before. So if you like pick out your outfit, get that all ready, give yourself enough time if you are traveling, but I know a lot of interviews are now online. um I think the main thing that really helped calm my nerves in the interview is forcing myself to pause after each and every question and making sure that I was in the room and not away in my own head. I think that really helps. But also, if you need to write things down, utilize that, because I think we have to hold on to so much knowledge and thoughts and reflections while in the interview. So if we can just take one of those things away and actually write down the question, that can be quite helpful. Um, and yeah, I think naming the fact that you're nervous can be quite helpful because then it's out in the room and they're more aware of it. And I think when you name it, you regain some more control over it, which can be quite helpful. And I think it comes with practice and also in removing some of the pressure from these AP roles. And I know that you're all watching these workshops because you really want an AP role, but to remember that you don't need an AP role to get onto the doctorate. There are so many people who have never had an assistant role. Both of my supervisors at work had never worked as an assistant, so they're clinical psychologists, never had an AP post. And so I think when you remember that, it takes away the pressure, because there is that pressure of, oh, if I don't get this interview, then it's going to be months before I'm going to get another one. Or I'm never going to get on the doctorate if I don't get an AP post. But that's not the case. So just to remember that as well going into your interview. And all you can do is do your best, and all you've got is your own previous experience. And if that's not enough, then that's okay. You'll try again with more experience and with more reflections. But it is anxiety provoking, and that is okay. Use those nerves. It makes sense that you're nervous in a job interview. So use that, and try and reframe it as maybe excitement. I know that helps some people, but it's difficult. It's hard.
I think we also, oh, sorry, I feel like we also had this one in our previous workshop.
Yeah,
So thinking about sharing your lived experience, and what draws you to the area. I mean, I think we kind of discussed that, like as I said before, kind of thinking about, what is it that you are comfortable to share. And I think for me, to decide that, it was very much of like, if I don't get this role, how am I going to feel having shared X, Y, Z, which was really a personal life, or lived experience for me. And I really thought very carefully about that. I probably found for myself really easier to speak about physical health as opposed to kind of mental health or anything related to that. It's just kind of easy for me to speak about. But I think it's just really holding in mind what you feel comfortable and how you're going to feel composed in that situation. like we kind of touched on just a moment ago, if you're anxious and you're speaking about something really personal, you'll have a lower window of tolerance and you may cry if that was a really personal experience. And you kind of don't really want to be doing that. It is okay to cry if that is a life experience, but you kind of don't want to have that added worry of like, now there's this additional thing that I've got to manage and take care of in a very anxious environment. So I think if you can think about this before your interview, really think about what you're comfortable with sharing. And if you're really not, that's also okay. I don't think that will go against you. But just being very honest, a bit like we said earlier, kind of saying something as though that you don't feel comfortable sharing this, but you've got this experience. Would they mind you sharing that instead? And I think that will go a long way. I don't know about you, Cheryl.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's remembering what you will leave in that room, and also how safe you're going to feel in that room with complete strangers. And there's also that power dynamic of them being clinical psychologists and them interviewing you. And so how that will feel for you, sharing something quite personal and then just leaving that and potentially never seeing these people again. But also you might see these people again. They might actually be hiring you. So do you feel comfortable with your colleagues now knowing this information about you? So just thinking about that, but also really paying attention to the fact of how mentioning your lived experience will benefit your answer. Really, is it really helping you to answer that question? Now, I know that this person said if it's asked you what draws you to this area, so I think even with that you can keep it very brief. You don't have to go into what specifically was your experience of that service. If it was maybe a CAMS team, you can just say, in the past when I was growing up I did have to use CAMS and I think this taught me something because blah blah blah. So just mentioning it within the context and how it has made you a better candidate. But there's no need to mention it. I don't think it makes any difference into how they perceive you. It's just about the way you utilize that experience, I think, and how you mention it and your own kind of boundaries around that. Yeah. And yeah, you have any,
There you go,
have you
it's
got
just
any,
our final one.
oh yeah, it's just our final question. So how do I get around they had more relevant clinical experience than you feedback?
I've had that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's frustrating, and I think in that moment I was probably like, well, that sucks. Like, I didn't want to be second, I wanted to be first. So, like, it's just really frustrating, and I think that's probably worse almost than not having constructive feedback because you actually were a really good fit for the role. They've kind of just done in a horrible way for people that got that and I didn't, but they just sort of have gone for an easy option. They know someone who's kind of trained that can go into that role, who might just need a little bit less support than you. But I think when I think about that now, I guess like hindsight is almost like a blessing. You kind of think about, yes, someone else did have that relevant experience, but you can go and apply to other places and you kind of leave with a lot more confidence, I think, of like, well, actually, yes, I'm really competent. I can get an AP role. Someone else just had that relevant experience that I didn't have. And I think it's something to really hold in mind. Like, you don't always need the same experience of where you're going to. It just depends on kind of who's hiring, and there's many roles that I've had that are completely different, but also I'm very much aware that I've had two neuropsychological based roles, and that probably has come from the fact that I had a lot of neuro experience and how that's probably helped in my role, and how that must be frustrating when I've got the role and other people haven't because of my experience. So in hindsight, it feels a lot better, but I think you should really just hold on to the fact that you are capable. You've literally got to second place, or someone's just had that little bit extra. And if you can, and they say that to you, ask them what is going to be more relevant, particularly if you were the second option, and just someone had that tiny bit more than you. Ask them what is more relevant because they must have an answer, particularly if someone just scored that little bit more than you. But also don't put yourself out. If that was just one particular role and one particular experience you didn't have, you probably will get others. You don't need to work for free and to do all of these things. So keep in mind what they say, but maybe think about that with a pinch of salt because you're practically already there.
Yeah, definitely. And really do take that piece of feedback with a pinch of salt, because you have to remember that you are competing essentially against other people for this role. So you might come to a different interview and you be the best out of that batch of candidates. And so it might be quite easy to get hung up around this feedback, and then you want to pursue this extra clinical experience, which I guess you can do. So it really depends on the situation. It's helpful to get more clarification as to what that more relevant clinical experience is. And then also thinking about the roles that you're applying to, actually. So thinking about your own experience, what are roles where you would have that relevant clinical experience? So for me, I worked in a dementia specialist care home. And so I applied for a lot of AP roles that are within older adult populations and more neuropsych based things, because I did have that more relevant experience. So you can play it in that way. But then you can also just try and find more relevant experience. So whether that be in your own current role, asking your supervisor, your managers, whether you can get more experience in different domains, if that's been highlighted. But it is very frustrating feedback to get, because it feels like it's in your control, but it's also out of your control, because it's in your control because you can get that extra clinical experience, but then it's out of your control because you don't know who you're competing against, and you might come to another interview where someone else might have that little bit extra. But I think the most helpful thing that you can do in that situation is get specific with what that relevant clinical experience is, because that could literally be anything. And actually you might have had that more relevant experience, but you just didn't mention it in your interview and you didn't highlight it as well as that other candidate did. Yeah, I think that's all I've got on that one, but it's hard.
I think also too in any feedback, and I'm pretty sure most people are polite, but I think also keeping polite, and I know it can be really hard, particularly when it's a no, or as you just said, when you've had the experience and you just kind of didn't say it. It can be so easy to be like, but I did have it, or like I just didn't say it was on my application form, and kind of remain professional. I know it's so hard when you're like really emotional, but I think that will hold you in good stead because, like I said earlier, if this post is re-advertised, particularly if someone gets on the course or they get more funding, you may well apply again. And if they kind of see, when you do turn up to interview, if they see you again, like your response is, one that they're going to remember. They would have known you. And I've certainly, I definitely applied for a role where I was there as an honorary and there as a wanting to apply for an assistant psychologist post. And I think your experience there and the way that you interact with a team, whether that's just the interview or just in your role, is really important because it's memorable and they will know even more so what type of person you are. You would have given them some of your insights, your experience. So be mindful of where you go in the future, how you say things. Don't glamorize and change things if you come back because they will know. Just be really careful, like remain professional. And there are also, I think, to add very, very quickly, really good clinical psychologists that may even offer you support. I was at once told no for a role, but also the clinical psychologist asked if I wanted to stay in contact for future assistant psychologist roles that I wanted to apply to if I needed any help. And I think if people offer you that, really, really take it up because they know how hard it is and you might not have scored enough to get that role, but they do want you to get another one and they've seen you perform. So they will be able to tailor your feedback a lot more than just anyone.
Yeah, those are all amazing points, Tashi. And I think that is the end
Yeah.
of today's workshop webinar recording. So thank you all for watching. If you do have any questions, then we can try and answer them. I think the comments will be open, but if not, then over on our Instagram. If you guys would like to, we'd really appreciate a donation. So we'll also link our GoFundMe either down below, but also over on our Instagram. And this is just to allow us to be able to run these events live. So I know we mentioned this in the previous webinar, but we are capped at 100 participants for a certain amount of time, which is not enough time for us to cover everything that we would like to. So if we had a premium version, then we'd be able to host these events live. So if you can't donate, then you can always share, because we do know that there are other people out there in the psychology field, maybe your supervisors, maybe some trainees, someone else who maybe would be willing to donate to this platform. So any help will be appreciated, to be honest. But yeah, I think that's all from us today. We'll see you later.
Thank you.